Remember the Alamo. You know those words. You've known them since you were a child. Remember Goliad. Have you heard those words? Because in the spring of 1836, both cries rang out equally across Texas. Both battles were invoked to rally men to the Texan cause. Both were used as symbols of Mexican brutality and Texan sacrifice. And then, over time, Goliad was forgotten. Or rather, it was allowed to fade, because the story of the Alamo was simply a better story in the way that Americans came to need stories to be. Here is what happened at Goliad. The town of Goliad, about 95 miles southeast of San Antonio, held a strategic position. The Mission La Bahia, renamed Fort Defiance by the Texans, controlled roads that Santa Anna's army would need for its advance. A force of several hundred Texan soldiers under the command of Colonel James Fannin had been ordered to hold it. Fannin was, by most accounts, not a good commander. He was irresolute, indecisive, and prone to half measures. When Travis had written desperate letters begging for reinforcements at the Alamo, Fannin had actually set out with a relief force, then turned back after one of his supply wagons broke down. He returned to Goliad and waited. After the Alamo fell, Fannin finally received orders to evacuate and retreat toward the Texan army. He delayed for days. When he finally marched his men out of the fort on March 19th, Santa Anna's general José de Urrea was already moving to intercept him. Fannin's force, approximately 300 soldiers plus several hundred more scattered in small detachments across the region, was caught in the open. In the Battle of Colito Creek, Fannin's men fought for their lives in a square formation on an open prairie surrounded by Mexican cavalry. They inflicted significant casualties, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The next morning, Urrea's artillery arrived. Fannin faced a choice: fight to the death or surrender. He surrendered. He was promised, according to his own account and the accounts of his men, that his soldiers would be treated as prisoners of war. They would be held until they could be exchanged or paroled and returned to the United States. That was the promise.
It was not kept. Santa Anna sent explicit orders. The prisoners were to be executed. General Urrea, by many accounts, was deeply uncomfortable with this order. He wrote to Santa Anna, asking for clemency. He argued that the men had surrendered under terms, that to execute them would violate the laws of war, that it would blacken Mexico's reputation internationally. Santa Anna refused. On March 27, 1836, Palm Sunday, the prisoners were divided into 3 groups and marched out of the fort. They were told they were being taken to the coast, to ships that would carry them home. They were marched a short distance, then the guards opened fire. 342 men were killed, shot at close range or bayoneted when the guns ran out. Those who tried to run were ridden down by cavalry. A small number escaped, perhaps 28 men who ran into the brush during the initial volley and made it into the river. 30 or so survivors who had been too ill to march were killed separately in the fort. The execution took the better part of the morning. The bodies were left where they fell, unburied. They were still lying on the prairie when Texan forces returned weeks later. The bones of the Goliad Massacre victims were not given a proper burial until 1938, more than 100 years later. Susanna Dickinson, who had survived the Alamo, heard about Goliad while she was already on her way east, carrying news of the Alamo's fall. Texas was reeling from 2 catastrophic defeats in less than a month. And Sam Houston, receiving this news, made the decision that would determine the outcome of the entire revolution. He ran. In a few minutes, we're going to show you how Houston's strategic retreat, which looked to almost everyone like cowardice and panic, was actually one of the most brilliant military decisions in North American history. But first, stay with us, because there are a few more names you need to know. James Fannin deserves a moment of particular attention because history has not been especially kind to him, and not entirely without reason, but also not entirely fairly.
Fannin was a Georgia planter's son who had attended West Point briefly but left before graduating. He came to Texas in 1834, established a plantation, and made himself prominent in the Revolution's early stages. He was genuinely brave. He fought at the Battle of Concepcion, one of the early engagements, and performed well. But as a commander, he struggled with decisive action. His delay in evacuating Goliad, days when he could have retreated safely and reached Houston's army, was a catastrophic failure. His men knew it. Some of them raged at him for it. And yet, and this is worth emphasizing, what happened to Fannin's men was not Fannin's fault. He surrendered under what he understood to be terms. The massacre was Santa Anna's decision, carried out against explicit protests from his own officers. Fannin was executed at Goliad alongside his men. He asked only that his personal belongings be sent to his family, that he be shot in the chest rather than the face, and that his body be given a proper burial. None of those requests were honored. By mid-April 1836, Texas was in full panic. The phrase that went through every settlement, every farm, every camp was the Runaway Scrape. Texan civilians, men, women, children, entire families, were fleeing east toward the border with Louisiana. They were terrified. The Mexican army was advancing. The Alamo had fallen. Goliad had been a massacre. Their general was retreating. And Sam Houston was still retreating. For weeks, Houston had led his growing but still ragged army eastward, always staying ahead of Santa Anna's pursuing forces. He drilled his men. He imposed discipline on a force that was essentially a mob of armed volunteers, and he refused to fight. His own officers were furious. His men were furious. The Provisional Texas government was furious. David Burnett, the interim president of the new Republic of Texas, sent Houston increasingly frantic messages demanding that he stop retreating and fight. There were calls for Houston to be removed from command. Houston ignored all of it. He was looking for the right ground. He was looking for the moment when everything would align, when Santa Anna would make a mistake, when the Mexican army would be vulnerable, when his own forces would be ready. And Santa Anna, in his arrogance, gave him exactly what he needed.
Santa Anna had divided his forces. He was operating in Texas with multiple columns spread across a wide area. He had detached significant forces in different directions. The column that was personally pursuing Houston had been reduced to approximately 1,200 men, still outnumbering Houston's force of roughly 900, but not by the overwhelming margins of earlier in the campaign. And then Santa Anna made a choice that defied military logic. He stopped. His force halted at a place called Lynch's Ferry on the San Jacinto River, near the Gulf Coast of Texas. It was a dead end. The river was behind them, a marsh on one side, and a boggy prairie on the other. It was precisely the kind of position any competent military officer is trained to avoid: boxed in, limited routes of retreat, vulnerable to surprise. Why did he stop there? Historians have argued about this for nearly 2 centuries. The most persuasive explanation is a combination of factors. Santa Anna was confident Houston would not attack. He was tired. He was waiting for reinforcements from the column of General Koss, and, some accounts suggest, he was spending the afternoon in the company of a young woman named Emily West, who may or may not have been a spy deliberately placed to keep Santa Anna distracted. Emily West, sometimes called the Yellow Rose of Texas, is one of the most debated figures in Texas history. She was a free woman of mixed race, a domestic servant who had been captured by Santa Anna's forces and brought along on the campaign. Whether she was an agent of Houston's, whether she deliberately kept Santa Anna occupied on the afternoon of April 21st, or whether the whole story is a later elaboration on a simpler fact, that Santa Anna was simply not paying attention, is genuinely contested. What is not contested is that on April 21st, 1836, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Sam Houston's army marched into a wooded area near the Mexican camp. Santa Anna's men were resting. Many were asleep. Their horses were tied up. Their weapons were stacked. The camp had no real defensive perimeter, no sentries deployed in force, no signal guns ready to fire an alarm. Houston formed his men in a long line. He had about 900 soldiers. He had 2 small cannons, nicknamed the Twin Sisters. He had a cavalry detachment under the command of Mirabel Lamar. And then, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, with the tall prairie grass providing cover until the last moment, he attacked. The battle cry was, "Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad." The Mexican camp erupted in panic. Soldiers scrambled for weapons, for horses, for any route of escape. The Texans fired their cannons into the camp, then charged. The fighting was close: rifle fire, bayonets, clubs, knives. The shooting lasted approximately 18 minutes. The pursuit lasted much longer. Houston was wounded, his ankle shattered by a musket ball during the assault. He stayed on his horse through the entire battle. The pain must have been extraordinary. His soldiers were not inclined toward mercy. The men who had survived the Runaway Scrape, who had heard about the Alamo and Goliad, who had spent weeks in frustrated retreat, they pursued the fleeing Mexican soldiers with a ferocity that Houston later said he could not entirely control. His orders to stop, to take prisoners, many were ignored in the heat of the moment. By the time the fighting truly ended, over 630 Mexican soldiers were dead. About 730 had been taken prisoner. Houston's losses were 9 killed and 30 wounded. It was not just a victory. It was a rout, a complete, total, annihilating rout of a force that had seemed utterly dominant 2 weeks before. Santa Anna was not captured in the battle. He fled. He was found the next day hiding in the tall grass near a small house, dressed in the uniform of a common private. A private who, the story goes, had been given a rather finer shirt than most common privates could afford. When he was brought into the Texan prisoner camp, the Mexican prisoners suddenly snapped to attention and began calling out, "El Presidente." The disguise was revealed. Houston, lying on the ground with his wounded leg propped against a tree, received the man who had ordered the massacre of the Alamo and Goliad. It is one of the great dramatic moments in American history. And Houston did not execute him. He needed him alive. Santa Anna, under the immediate threat of death from Houston's men, who very much wanted to kill him on the spot, agreed to negotiate. Within days, he had signed the treaties of Velasco, a public treaty acknowledging the end of hostilities, and a secret treaty in which Santa Anna personally pledged to work for Mexican recognition of Texas independence and to use his influence to ensure Mexican forces withdrew south of the Rio Grande. In exchange, Santa Anna's life was spared. He would eventually be returned to Mexico.
But here is the problem that would fester for the next decade. The Mexican government refused to recognize the treaties. From Mexico City's perspective, Santa Anna had signed those documents under duress, as a prisoner of war. They were not legitimate agreements. Mexico did not recognize the independence of Texas. As far as Mexico was concerned, Texas was still a rebellious province. Texas considered itself an independent republic. Mexico considered Texas a territory in rebellion. That dispute would not be resolved peacefully. It would not be resolved at all until the United States intervened. And that intervention would cost thousands of lives, provoke an enormous political crisis in Washington, and ultimately expand American territory by a third. But that is the story of the war to come. For now, in April of 1836, with the smoke of San Jacinto still hanging over the battlefield, let's stay with the people whose stories the history books have left behind. Joe's story. His name was Joe. That is all the name we have. He was a young man, probably in his early 20s, owned by William Barrett Travis. He had no choice about being at the Alamo. He was brought there because his enslaved status meant he went where Travis went. Joe fought in the final battle. He fired from the walls. Survivors' accounts describe him as a capable and brave fighter in the desperate, confused close-quarters combat of the final assault. After the battle, Joe was questioned by Santa Anna through an interpreter. He answered questions about the garrison's numbers, their weapons, their leadership. He had no reason to be loyal to the men who had enslaved him. He answered honestly. Santa Anna released him. He was, after all, enslaved property, not a combatant in the sense that Santa Anna recognized. Letting him go served Santa Anna's purpose. It added another messenger to carry news of the fall of the Alamo eastward. Joe's testimony, gathered by multiple people over the days following the battle, appeared in Texas newspapers and American newspapers within weeks. It is the most specific, most geographically accurate, most detailed account of the battle's final assault that exists. Historians have used it as the primary lens through which the final assault is understood. And then Joe largely disappears from the historical record.
He escaped from Texas at some point in 1837. Escaped slavery, that is. He made it to freedom by routes that historians have not been able to fully trace. What happened to him after that, where he went, whether he found family, whether he lived a long life or a short one, we do not know. What we know is this: the most important eyewitness account of the Battle of the Alamo was given by a man who was enslaved, who was only at the Alamo because he had no right to be anywhere else, and who has been systematically marginalized in the telling of this story for nearly 200 years.
Joe's testimony deserves to be quoted, read, and remembered. He deserves to be named in the same sentence as Travis and Bowie and Crockett. He was there. He survived. He told the truth. Juan Seguin's story. Juan Seguin was born in San Antonio de Bexar in 1806. His father was a prominent Tejano civic leader. Seguin grew up in the city, learned to be a rancher and a political leader, and was deeply committed to his community. He joined the Texas Revolution out of genuine political conviction. He believed, with good reason, that Santa Anna's centralized authoritarianism was a threat to the communities he loved and the constitutional principles he valued. He was not fighting for the United States. He was fighting for a vision of what Texas could be. He was a brilliant cavalryman. After riding out of the Alamo with Travis's dispatches, he went on to distinguish himself repeatedly in the campaigns that followed. He commanded a company of Tejano cavalry at the Battle of San Jacinto. When his men rode into battle, they wore playing cards in their hatbands to identify themselves, so that Texan forces in the heat of battle would not mistake them for Mexican soldiers and shoot them. Think about that for a moment. They had to wear identification markers to avoid being killed by their own side, because to Anglo-Texan soldiers in the chaos of battle, a dark-skinned man speaking Spanish looked like the enemy. After the Revolution, Seguin served as a senator in the Texas Republic and then as mayor of San Antonio. He worked to protect Tejano land rights and cultural identity in the new republic. And then it all fell apart. Anglo settlers flooded into San Antonio. Land disputes erupted. Seguin found himself accused, falsely he maintained, of collaborating with Mexico. Death threats were made against him and his family. By 1842, the situation had become untenable.
Juan Seguin, the man who had ridden out of the Alamo carrying William Barrett Travis's last letters, the man who had fought at San Jacinto, the man who had served the Republic of Texas as senator and mayor, had to flee Texas. He fled to Mexico to escape Anglo vigilante violence. He lived in exile in Mexico for years, eventually returning to Texas decades later as an old man. He died in Nuevo Laredo in 1890 on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. His memoirs, written with bitterness and grief, are one of the most important documents of the Texas Revolution. They are almost never included in the standard teaching of this history. The Mexican conscript soldiers. We don't have the names of most of them. That is the honest truth. The Mexican army that campaigned in Texas in 1836 was largely composed of men whose names were never recorded with care, whose letters home, if they wrote any, have not survived, whose graves were not marked. They are the forgotten mass of this story, as the forgotten are everywhere in history, which is to say, completely. What we know from accounts like De La Peña's is that they were largely indigenous men from the poorer regions of Mexico. They were conscripted, taken, often by force, from their communities. Many spoke indigenous languages rather than Spanish as their first language. They marched 1,000 miles through winter cold. They were given inadequate supplies. They were used as instruments of a political and personal project that had nothing to do with their own lives. They died in large numbers, far larger than the American histories of the Alamo tend to acknowledge. The Mexican casualty figures from the final assault are disputed, but most serious historians believe the losses were several times what official Mexican accounts reported. Santa Anna had reasons to minimize the casualties of a battle that should have been won far more cheaply. These men were not given heroes' funerals. They were not given any funerals at all in most cases. The Mexican army moved on after the Alamo. The dead were left behind. They were doing what soldiers throughout history have done, following orders in a war that meant nothing particular to them, dying for reasons they were never really asked about. Susanna Dickinson. Susanna Dickinson was 19 years old when the Alamo fell. She was the wife of artillery officer Almiron Dickinson, who died in the battle. She had taken shelter in the church with her 15-month-old daughter Angelina and several other women and children.
She survived. Santa Anna questioned her, gave her a blanket and 2 silver pesos, and sent her east with Joe and a few others to carry news of the Alamo's fall. She arrived at Sam Houston's camp with her infant daughter. She described what she had seen. Her account, combined with Joe's, gave Houston and the world the first clear picture of what had happened. Susanna Dickinson survived the Texas Revolution, the Republic, and the eventual annexation into the United States. She lived until 1883. She was married multiple times, and her life was not easy. She struggled with poverty and family difficulties for much of it. But she carried the memory of the Alamo with her for nearly 50 years.
She was one of the last living links to that morning in March 1836. And when she died, she took with her memories that no one had thought to record carefully enough. She deserves to be remembered as something more than a footnote in the story of men who died more dramatically than she did. Texas was free. On April 21, 1836, 18 minutes of battle at San Jacinto ended the Texas Revolution. The Republic of Texas was born. And in some ways, that was the easy part. What followed was a decade of chaos that American history tends to skip over as quickly as possible, because it reveals something uncomfortable about both the promise and the reality of Texas independence. The new republic was essentially bankrupt. It had no money, a tiny population, and enormous territory it could not effectively govern or defend, and a neighbor, Mexico, that refused to recognize its existence and periodically sent military forces back across the Rio Grande to remind Texas of its vulnerability. The Comanche Nation, which had not been a party to any of this revolution, had no intention of accepting Anglo-Texan authority over lands they had controlled for generations. The so-called Comanche problem, which is to say the Comanche people's entirely reasonable refusal to have their territory taken from them, would consume the Republic of Texas for its entire brief existence. The Tejano communities that had fought alongside the revolution found themselves, year by year, pushed off land they had held for generations. Old Spanish land grants were challenged in the new republic's Anglo-dominated courts. Communities that had existed before the first American settler ever arrived found themselves declared squatters on their own soil. Juan Seguin's story was not exceptional, it was representative.
The enslaved peoples whose illegal presence had been one of the triggers for Mexican-Texan conflict in the first place. The new Republic of Texas made slavery not just legal, but constitutionally protected. The brief, complicated hope of freedom that Mexican law had technically offered, that hope was extinguished. Texas would be a slave republic, and slavery would define its economics and its politics for the rest of its independent existence. Sam Houston served as the republic's first president. He tried, with imperfect and often unsuccessful effort, to navigate all of these contradictions. He negotiated with the Comanche. He managed his republic's impossible finances. He lobbied Washington for annexation. Washington was not interested, not yet. Annexation of Texas would mean admitting another slave state to the Union, and the northern states were not willing to accept that without a fight. The issue of Texas hung over American politics like a thundercloud through the late 1830s and early 1840s, with no resolution in sight. And then, in 1844, an election changed everything. A dark horse candidate named James K. Polk ran for President of the United States on a platform of aggressive territorial expansion. He won. And in his inaugural address, he made clear that the annexation of Texas, and a lot more besides, was coming. Texas was admitted to the United States on December 29, 1845. Mexico considered this an act of war. And Mexico had a point. The Mexican government had never recognized Texan independence. As far as Mexico was concerned, the United States had just annexed a Mexican province. And then, in a dispute over exactly where the border of the new state lay, American troops marched into territory that Mexico also claimed. On May 13, 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. The soldiers who would fight that war carried those three words with them: "Remember the Alamo," as a rallying cry. Many of them were young men who had grown up with the story of the Alamo as a founding myth, a story of noble sacrifice, of brave men dying for freedom. They knew the legend.
They didn't know Joe. They didn't know Juan Seguin. They didn't know the names of the young Mexican conscripts who had marched 1,000 miles through winter cold. But now you do. The men who marched into Mexico in 1846 would fight battles that make the Alamo look like a skirmish. They would cross deserts, storm fortresses, fight in city streets, and in the process take away from Mexico roughly half of its territory, land that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. That is the story of the Mexican-American War, and that story really begins, in the minds and hearts of people who looked at a crumbling old Spanish mission in San Antonio and decided it meant something. They were right. It did mean something. The question worth asking, the question this series will keep asking is, what did it mean? And for whom? Texas was free, but 10 years of chaos, debt, and war with Mexico would follow before the United States finally agreed to annex it. And that decision, made by one determined president, would drag America into the bloodiest foreign war it had ever fought. In video 28, we go inside the Republic of Texas, 10 years of ambition, debt, diplomacy, and desperation, and follow the road that leads, step by step, to the war. Thank you for watching Nostalgia History. If this video moved you, if it changed how you understood a story you thought you already knew, please share it. Subscribe. Leave a comment with the name that affected you most, because these stories only survive if we tell them. And we owe it to Joe. We owe it to Once Again. We owe it to all the forgotten ones, to remember them.